This is a Reaper skull. It's on a saddlebag of a Harley that I'm currently working on. In my other skull videos, whether it's a tutorial video or just a time-lapse video, in most of those videos I'm using subtractive techniques, meaning I'm removing paint with different tools, whether that's an eraser or a razor blade or chemical, in order to create texture as well as bring out highlights in the piece. That works really well if you're working over a very light colored or white colored base coat. In this case, I'm working over a black base coat, so that is not a good option. Everything you see here has been created by adding paint with the airbrush. So I've already got some texture created using the neutral gray on this. So sometimes I will come back and just lightly dust a little bit of this black over what I've already created. Darken up this edge. And by putting that light wash of this illustration black over the neutral gray that we already have established, it just pushes the texture that we've already created back just a little bit. Then I can come back closer and add a little bit more texture with this darker color. I'm just spraying random little shapes into the area. You can also use texture stencils if you have them. Those put off a little bit crisper texture into the design, especially if you're holding the stencil directly against the surface. You can pull it back slightly and it will give you a softer texture. For most of this, I'm using just the airbrush and adding little random dots in the area. That looks pretty good. Now I will clean the airbrush out and switch back to the neutral gray number 7. So I can come in, you see how well this color is spraying, and really develop some of the highlights back into this little triangle shaped portion down the bottom of the nose socket. And then I can start building some lighter areas as well as texture below it as well. This is the same thing I was just doing with the black. I'm creating little dots, and a lot of this is just really fine lines, and I'm just moving the airbrush around in random patterns in order to create that texture and highlights. Sometimes I use just lines. It's a mixture of textures that really brings this to life, really makes it look a lot more believable. So I can create some lines up here. And then as I move further down, I'll start using more of the dot texture. I don't know if you can see this on camera that well or not, but I'm not working the trigger back and forth. Once I get the paint flowing where I like it, I just leave it flowing and just move the airbrush around to create that texture effect. And it works really well. You can see all these areas up in the top and this area right here. That's exactly how I created a lot of that texture, was just start paint flowing with the airbrush, and once I've got it where I want it, I'll leave it on. You don't want to stay in one spot for very long, or you'll create really bright spots, or you might even get spidering. But that's a very simple method for creating some neat texture in your work. Especially for those who may not have a lot of experience with their airbrush, because you don't have to worry so much about working the trigger back and forth to shut the paint off and turn the paint on using that method. Now, I'm not saying you do that all the time. Right now, I am actually working the dual action trigger on the brush, creating some fine little highlights, both using dots and lines. This area right here would be more in highlight from my light source, which is coming from the left. So I want to brighten up some of this, but I don't want to kill everything. Some of it I want to leave darker. I'm going to carry this highlight up right here. Again, same process or same technique I'm using here. I've got the paint flowing the way I want it, and now I'm just randomly moving the airbrush around in order to create that little bit of texture. I'm not happy with how dark that shadow is right along that little triangle shaped, so I'm going to lighten that up a little bit. Same thing on the other side now. Bottom area of this will be more in highlight. And you can see I messed up and got outside of the line there just a little bit. That's no big deal. I'll fix that later. When I switch back to the black, that looks pretty good. I think I'm going to switch back to the black now and darken some of that up. So I will clean the airbrush out off camera and switch back to black. I'm going to darken up the shadow on that side of this little nose protrusion. And then same process, I can come in, start building a little bit of texture with this black over the white. And some of you may be thinking, well, that's redundant. You just covered the black you already created texture with the gray just a minute ago. Why are you coming back in with black again? And the reason is I work in layers. Adding these layers is what helps to create a realistic texture and that depth. Even though I'm painting in multiple layers, you can still see a lot of the texture and the detail that was created in the layers underneath. We're not actually covering everything completely. And this is probably hard to see on camera, but you can actually still see a lot of the detail and in those layers that were created previously. And I will switch and start adding some lines into it as well. Just very small, faint lines. I can clean up that mistake I made a few minutes ago. I like to vary the direction of those little lines that I create. If everything you do is going in the same direction or looks the same, you're going to lose some of that believability, because it will look contrived. It will look like it was created. Just cleaning up some of these edges with this black. So hopefully you can see with this over-reduced illustration black, I'm creating more texture subtly, and I'm also creating shadow in this area, but you can still see the texture that was created with the neutral gray number 7 previously. And watch out for tip dry. If you notice that paint is not coming out of your airbrush when you pull the trigger back far enough to normally allow paint to flow, probably have some tip dry. You can also use this color to create some darker little holes and cracks in your work as well. Hopefully you can see this is really just little random lines and dots. And that's really all I'm using to create the texture. That looks pretty good. I'm going to switch back to the neutral gray number 7 one more time. So I will continue, build back some of the highlights that I just covered up. Still building texture. I'm also receding this color. I'm not going quite as far out in this area right here as I did previously. I'm just kind of hitting that ridge of that higher area or highlighted area. Tip of it and more of a highlight. I can pull back with this neutral gray number 7 too and fog in to pull out some of these highlights as well. And this neutral gray number 7 is pretty bright. It's not far from a pure white. It looks very bright on here now because it doesn't have any white to contrast it with. Once I go in and add the pure white highlights, you'll see how dark this color actually is. And I think that's a really good way, in my opinion, of making your final highlights really stand out and pop, is using this neutral gray. You could easily use just opaque white to come in and do all of this underpainting first and then shade it with your opaque, or I'm sorry, your transparent black. I prefer now really using this neutral gray number 7 for the initial layers, simply because once you put the white over it, it is super bright. You really get nice highlights. And that'll depend on what you're actually painting as well. This is more of a fantastical themed paint job, so I can have a little bit of fun with it and make it look somewhat realistic, but also play on the fantasy portions of the artwork. Hopefully you can see these are just little bitty lines that I'm creating. Just bringing back a little bit of these highlights. Whoops. And I'll add just a touch of a highlight around some of these darker holes and divots that I created with that black. And that's really all there is to it as far as creating texture and form without using subtractive techniques. And like I said, it's good to have a variety of techniques in your toolbox that you can use, because not every technique is always going to work with every project that you have. And there's kind of an overall view of what I have going on this saddlebag so far. I hope all of that made sense. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. Let me know in the comments if you like this style of video, and I will create more of them. If not, then I'll try to figure something else out. Till next time, I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I'll see you all next time.